Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of Minnesota and the Elmer L. Andersen Library. I'm Jody Gray. I am the Associate University Librarian for Research at the University of Minnesota Libraries. And I'm standing in for Dean Lisa German, who is unable to be here this evening, but she does send her regrets. Tonight's event features Taiyon J. Coleman, a writer, scholar, and educator, who will be reading tonight from her book, Traveling Without Moving, Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America. A little bit about Dr. Coleman. She is a Cave Canem and Voices of Our Nation's Arts Fellow, a 2017 recipient of a McKnight Foundation Artist Fellowship in Creative Prose, and is one of the 12 emerging children's writers of color selected as a recipient of the 2018 and 2019 Mirrors and Windows Fellowship, funded by the Loft Literary Center and the Jerome Foundation in Minnesota. She is also the Dean of Liberal Arts and Academic Foundations at North Hennepin Community College. One of Dr. Coleman's essays in Traveling Without Moving includes her experience here at the library's Mapping Prejudice project. Following her reading tonight, there will be a conversation between Dr. Coleman and Mapping Prejudice co-founder Kirsten Delegard. At the end of the program, we will have time for audience questions. Dr. Delegard will also be making some introductory remarks, but before handing this over to her, I would like to acknowledge the peoples upon whose land we meet. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And I'll just add, I'm one of those American Indian staff members. I'm from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and even though I'm not on that land comes with me wherever I am in my heart. So I like to let people know that that's a part of me and my experience. So with that, though, I am going to have Kirsten Delegard come on up.
So, good evening. Hello, how is everyone today? Hey, did you like the intro music? Yeah. So what was it? Stevie Wonder, thank you. So the reason that we played that, as I said, as the walk-on music for our star tonight is that that song was in her acknowledgments for this book as one of the inspirations that got her through many, not just writing this book, but many tough times, and including writing a dissertation, which we all need lots of help to get through. So I'm so delighted to be here tonight and sharing the stage with my dear friend, Dr. Coleman, and I want to expand a little bit on Jody's comments or introduction to say more about her accomplishments, because we can't say enough. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of being in a room with a Dr. Coleman before, you're in for a treat tonight. So Tai is a teacher, she's a leader in higher education, and she's a lyrical writer with a mastery of many genres. Her work has been published in a wide range of venues that reflects the breadth and depth and scope of her creative production. And we're here tonight to celebrate this beautiful book. Can you hold it up? Can someone hold it up? So there we go. See, yes, thank you. Which showcases her personal essays, but she writes all kinds of other things too, literary analysis and poetry. Were any of you here with us in the winter of early 2023 in Golden Valley or in North Minneapolis? Yeah, okay. And again, Ty was the star for those, for our Bridging the Fault Lines events, which were, we designed them to showcase the Jim Crow of the North digital vignettes from TPT. And as a complement to those short documentary pieces, Ty read poems from another one of her collections, Communicating with the Dead, Narrative Pandemic Love Poems. And those lyrical and heart-wrenching odes introduced us to some of the early victims of the COVID pandemic. And her poems talk about the way the pandemic amplified the profound race and class disparities here in the United States. But tonight, we're here to talk about essays from a Black woman trying to survive in America, traveling without moving. And the collection is newly released from the University of Minnesota. It's available for purchase out in the atrium. And Ty, these essays are intensely personal, right? You write about birth, you write about death, you write about visits from the dead, you write about reading, you write about teaching, you write about writing. You have a lot to say about your time here at the University of Minnesota. Which awarded you both an MFA in poetry and a PhD in English literature. You also have an MA in English from Iowa State. Ty has received several prestigious fellowships that recognize her contributions as a public intellectual, a writer, and a teacher. These include a McKnight Fellowship and a large grant from the Mellon Foundation. And this is my favorite of your awards. She was and continues to be a Mapping Prejudice affiliated scholar. And whenever you talk about writing, you always explain that the stories that you're telling do not belong to you. You describe yourself as a vessel for a collaborative and cumulative process with your ancestors. You give voice to them. You detail their survival within structures that demand their sacrifices to maintain a certain way of American life. You share so much that is intimate and powerful and insightful about yourself and your family in this book. But these autobiographical essays are meant to be a broader reflection on this moment and how we arrived here, and we're going to talk about that. They're vehicles for celebrations and critiques of family relationships, of racism, of misogyny, of the power dynamics in the classroom, of the University of Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, and the United States. It's a little book, I just want to say. And that's why these essays are deeply personal for me. They've been calling on me since I first read one of her essays in 2016 to interrogate some of the most tenacious myths about the profession that the two of us have chosen, as well as this place that you and I call home. So these essays serve up equal doses of beauty, of faith, of hope and outrage, and that's the cocktail that I need right in this moment. So with that, will you come up and we can have a conversation, talk more?
Well, first, thank you for the introduction, and then I also want to say good evening. How are you? Okay, we got to do that again. Good evening. See, call and response. And I want to thank you so much for coming and being here with us. I mean, you could have done anything on your Thursday night, and you're here spending it with us, a conversation. So just know how much gratitude that I have for that, and I want to say thank you. I also want to say, too, if something resonates with you, please take it. If it doesn't, let it roll off your back like water. And I'm also going to apologize in advance because we're good friends. So if we get going, like somebody just say, come back, reel it back in. And also, too, you can tell how just wonderfully prepared and planned she is. And here I am, the extemporaneous person. So know that we will go back.
This has been a tension.
We will go back and forth. But texture is good. So can we start with the...
You did.
Okay. All right. So let's see. So gratitude. And I feel like as I age more and more in a state of gratitude. I'm over 50 now. My mother died prematurely at 49. And I feel like every opportunity I get to be here, right there, but for the grace of God go I. So just thank you. And also that sense of if I can hold space, like we're in present moment, but I think we never really understand what's happening. Does that make sense? Which is not a bad thing, right? Okay. I like this quote from Frederick Douglass, and as a scholar of literature, and know that it's hard for me to use those words. So one, please call me T-Bone on a bad day. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mom, very proudly. But to me, like, I'm always that person with my double Dutch rope and my bag of candy on the corner of 103rd. I love literature. I never thought it was something you could do or, that you could teach and make a living talking about literature. That was something we didn't talk about. But Frederick Douglass has this wonderful quote. He said black people had 3 tools: their voice, their pen, and their vote. Today, all 3 are under threat. And it's interesting to read this scholar who existed and lived in the 19th century, but his words to be so applicable and valid today. So who am I? So my mom is there holding me. Can you guess which one am I?
One in her arm?
Yes, I'm the ham hock in her arms. And my older sister is to her right, and I'm still bigger than she is. And this is on our porch on the south side of Chicago. And of course, my mom and dad will have 3 more kids trying to work it out. And that is my mom. And this picture was gifted to me after she died, almost as if she was going through an ancestor to give it to me. So everything that I am has come through her, literally. So this is my mom and dad on the right. Interesting story, and I love stories. And I love my father. He's still around, thank God. And then on the right, I always used to tease my mom, like, how'd you get your hair like that? And she was like, it's a wig. And then on your right, I'm sorry, which one am I?
On the right.
Yeah, laughing, right, and that's me. So always inappropriate sense of humor, always having fun. And but it's only when I come back later and I look at my mom and I see how emaciated she is, how she was literally doing her best to take care of us. The picture is not showing the tree, it's away from the tree because we didn't have enough money to buy gifts. But all the clothes that we have on, my mother made by hand. This is my granddaddy, Frank Coleman, 2 generations removed from Mississippi. He left Mississippi when he was 15. The picture, now that I'm looking at it, looks so much like my 13-year-old son, a little bit. Vernon, can you see that? And that's why I say I've started to humble myself to the universe, or God has higher plans. But he loved writing, and he loved reading, and he must have saw something in me because he would always give me books. So out of the 5 of us, he would be the one. I would be the one. He would give me books, and he would tell his stories too. This is his mother, Alora, and his brother, Edward. During the Great Migration, they left Mississippi first, and this picture was taken in St. Louis, and they left him in Mississippi by himself. And you think about the Great Migration and how people left and made it out, right? And so eventually my granddaddy would leave at 15. He stopped in St. Louis, but he didn't stay. And so it's a personal story that's true to my family, but it's also a structural story of historic significance. So this notion that we can tell our stories, and by telling our individual stories, we are also telling larger structural stories. And of course, when I was little, I didn't understand that. That was just my grandma, right? And this is my grandmother and grandfather, Frank Coleman again. I love this picture because the one on my right, on your left, he kept in his office. And you can't tell, but he used to straighten his hair. And my grandmother thought that he was more attractive because his hair wasn't, super curly. And then once they married, he stopped straightening his hair. And he just laughed, and I thought that was so funny. And these are my father's parents. And my grandmother was from Arkansas. These are the parents of my mom in Sparta, Illinois. Eventually, I would go on to Iowa State. And when I got there, didn't know what the hell was going on. Dropped out for 5 years and clawed my way back, which doesn't happen. Came back, finished my bachelor's degree, and finished my master's degree in English. I was recruited to the University of Minnesota as a Ronald McNair Scholar, TRIO program. Are you familiar with that? Very proud. And think of the legacy, right? He would have been the second black astronaut. And literally, he had to explode on a shuttle in order for me to get an education. And part of the McNair Scholarship was to fund underrepresented students to pursue terminal advanced degrees. So I had finished my master's as a TRIO, as a Ronald McNair Scholar at Iowa State, and I was recruited to the University of Minnesota. And I had a really good friend here, and then I knew that Prince was here, and that was important. And it really was the deciding factor. So when I say I love Prince, let me be clear. Like, I adore him. I know adore, that's the name of a song. But when I came here, Dr. John Wright, who's not here, was my advisor for my dissertation, but then he was just the first African-American male college professor that I ever had. And I'll never forget, it was the Harlem Renaissance. And he was an amazing instructor, and we would go on, just tremendous mentor and supporter of me. So the first year of the PhD program, I received the Givens Fellowship, and I worked here as the Givens Fellow, as a PhD candidate for a year. And part of my work was to archive 30 years of personal letters between June Jordan and Ethelbert Miller. So when you say who I am, can you imagine going back and forth between the East Bank and the West Bank? And I had a great time, but y'all read my work. I love humor. I would say PhD programs are like analogous to the Gladiator. Okay, you can laugh, it's okay. And this was my safe haven. I love being here. I love reading the letters. And of course, she's a brilliant black feminist, lesbian writer, just amazing. And Ethelbert Miller, a great writer in his own right. But of course, their relationship, as you can see, I think he was, almost 17 plus years her junior. And they would go on to have this wonderful, steamy love affair. But she also mentored him, right, and taught him what it meant to be a black writer, right? And they would go on to be serious friends to the point where when she was diagnosed with cancer, they would write each other. She said, no, you need to get married. Like, it's just amazing 30-year span of relationship. And I got to read those letters. So I was part of this. Should I stop? Okay. Part of the archives, she, like any poet, right? And so my MFA is in poetry because when I finished my master's, I was supposed to go to law school, and I can remember my advisor had the Harvard application, and she would push it across the desk, and I would push it back, and she'd push it across the desk. And it was too late, right? I took a class called Literature from the Edge, and it changed my life. So, I mean, I love law, so anybody's a JD, please don't be offended. But I knew that that wasn't my path, right? 1977 poems for Fannie Lou Hamer. So what June Jordan would do, she would type these poems and she would mail them to Ethelbert, right? So you can see a copy for Ethelbert Love. JJ, do you see that? And then March 31st, 1977, and you guys can check your phones. I think it's March 14th, March 13th that she died. And of course died, hypertension, so high blood pressure. She had surgeries for breast cancer, poverty, all the things that black women are dying of today. So of course, 20 years ago, I didn't know that. I was just this nosy poet, getting to read the inside and thinking it was really cool. But also, can you imagine, she's teaching Ethelbert Miller, how do you become a poet? So not only do you type poems and you share them, but then voila, the poem then is published in the New York Times. But if you didn't have the archive, you wouldn't know of their relationship and what's happening. Isn't it amazing? So then not only are you talking about the political, but you're also talking about what? The personal. And I want to take a step in my work that you cannot separate black love from black politics. It goes hand in hand, right? Nikki Giovanni in this poem called Nikki Rosa, have you ever read it? At the end she says, black love is black wealth. So I love you, and let's talk about what else is going on. It's all connected. And so voila, he learns. Grand Army Plaza for Ethelbert. And although I've been to New York, I don't think I've been to this place in Brooklyn, but it is a monument that was erected to the Civil War. And again, for Ethelbert with my love, July 4th, 1980. And I'm just going to read just a couple of lines. But on this hard ground curved by memories of union and disunion and of brothers dead by the familiar land, how do we face to face a man, a woman, interpenetrated, free, and reaching still toward the kiss that will not suffocate? We are not survivors of a civil war. We survive our love because we go on loving. And in preparation for today, thinking about the recent election, right, regardless of where you stand, and people thinking about how do we survive, maybe as the poem says, because we what? Even despite this civil war that we're still in, we still can go on what? Loving. But of course, like any teacher, she's showing him. So she writes the poem, and then it is what? Published. And he finally gets it. And then he turns around and publishes the poem back to her in 1981. It took him a year in Essence magazine. And again, if you didn't have the letters, you wouldn't see the depth of the relationship and the love, but also what? The teaching, the mentoring that's happening. And by 1980, the letters start in 1977, he's figured out this is how you start to what? Be a poet, build a career. And of course, from publications, then becomes what? The book, right? So not only do I have an affair with you, I love you, we become friends, but I give you a gift that will last what? Forever.
Yeah, I'm going to ask some more questions.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think you've seen why she's an incredible teacher, right? Yeah. So,
well, that's who I am, super nerd, right?
You are super nerd. Yes, we're going to talk more about that.
Can I just add one more thing, though?
Of course.
And I just want to say, because I'm not being funny at all. Sometimes I still don't know who I am. I feel like I'm still figuring it out. Do you guys feel that way too? But I understood that I loved literature, and I love to write literature, and I love teaching writing. And how do you bring all those three things together, and how do you talk about all those three things? And I think that has been the sense of trying to figure it out. And maybe then the essay is how I can work to figure that out. Okay,
Love
thanks.
So I want to talk about when we first met, right? So one of the essays in the anthology was a part of another collection. Disparate Impacts was published in the 2016 collection, A Good Time for the Truth. And this book really opened up a new narrative space in Minnesota. And I would say it opened up the narrative space in which Mapping Prejudice was conceived. I often, in things that I write about where Mapping Prejudice came from, I quote from the introduction to this anthology by the essay by Sun Yun Shin, and who said, "Race is often invisible to those who benefit, willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly. It is entirely visible to those who do not benefit." And my colleagues and I, we created Mapping Prejudice to make structural racism visible here in Minnesota. So even though I loved that essay, I was a fangirl, that's not what brought us together. It was another one of your essays that ultimately did that, Poems as Maps. So the editor of the University of Minnesota Alumni Magazine, Elizabeth Larson, had seen that essay, and she decided to do some matchmaking. She assigned you to write an article about Mapping Prejudice in the spring of 2018. I think she was hoping to get a creative frame for what she might have seen as sort of a data project. And I'm guessing that she wouldn't have ever guessed that that assignment would turn into this long-term collaboration and friendship. So I'll never forget our first meeting. You came down to the Borchard Map Library, and our whole team sat around the table, and we sat there for hours. And so the Borchard Map Library is in the sub-basement of Wilson Library. It's this magical place, but it's not a magical space, okay? And I'd never met Ty before, but she pulled out this stack of papers. Like, she's accusing me of being super prepared. She had the stack of papers, and she was paging through, asking question after question. And she looked up and she was like, I always do my homework. I'm the nerd who always does my homework. So you asked us all kinds of questions, and I think Penny will confirm, Penny Peterson, my co-founder, was there with us too, that it was a really transformational interview for us as a team, because you did the teaching just like you did just now, right? It was that interview was a turning point for me to really start to understand the full humanistic import of maps. That maps are not just for navigation, they're not just tools for extraction, they're works of art. And they're very personal. As you say in your essay, they allow people to map very personal things, universal narratives, images, and emotions. Maps are vehicles for self-awareness and understanding, and that concept has really been at the center of our work, our Mapping Prejudice work. So I want to ask you what you like about maps, and I want to ask you about that essay. So I'm just going to ask those questions, and you can answer those, and you can or read or do whatever combination. Whatever moves you.
Okay. I think this is why I go back to Frederick Douglass, and I'll answer the question. So when you read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, when you get to the point where he's learning how to read and he's teaching himself how to read, right? He's first with his mistress. She gets caught by her husband. Then the boys, that the poor white boys, right? And he points out that they're poor, right? How clever, like he's even understanding class stratification. But once he's literate, he says, I didn't understand what slavery was. And he was a slave. So imagine living your whole life in something, being a victim of it, but you don't know what it is. So then come full force to Mapping Prejudice. To me, it was the same thing. I was like, oh, that's what that is. And if you think about it, right, Kimberly Crenshaw says, you can't see something unless you have a frame. So literally it can be in front of you and completely invisible, even to yourself. But then if someone gives you a frame, it's almost like a picture appears, and then you start to understand something even more. And I felt like that's what was Mapping Prejudice to me. And it's not that I'd never, I didn't hear of segregation or Jim Crow or housing, but not the connection to thinking how housing and housing discrimination correlates to disparities in health, right? Disparities in wealth. Where you're born can predict your life expectancy, whether or not you will be incarcerated, what type of diseases you will have. All of this simply because of your zip code, and that we intentionally created this type of paradigm. So for me, it was one of those aha moments that it became a key or a frame by which I could work to talk about things that I had been experiencing or things that I felt was important to the literature. And I don't, oppression is one thing, but oppression, I think, is even more intense when you can't explain it. When you have a world that doesn't give you the language to explain it, because that's how the language was constructed, or the world was constructed, to keep it invisible. So that visibility becomes the first step in dismantling it. So if you're okay, I can read the first part of the essay, why it resonated with me. And I just want to thank my husband of 23 years and my 3 kids, because I'm always putting our business in the street. Making the invisible visible. 14 years ago, when my realtor asked me to wait in the Nokomis Public Library at the corner of the block while he met with the white homeowners of a 1925 cottage bungalow, 2-bedroom house that my husband and I wanted to make an offer on, I didn't give it much thought. I trusted him. We'd been looking at homes in South Minneapolis for months, and every homeowner of every house that we viewed south of 46th Street, east of Portland Avenue, and west of Hiawatha Avenue never accepted our bids, even when my husband and I seemed to be the only buyers making an offer. When my realtor asked me to wait in the library, I didn't think about the first time that we actually saw the bungalow. We drove by it several times at night. I only thought about the softly lit wood frame piano windows that I could make out from our slowly moving car, despite the home's worn roof and peeling stucco exterior, which it still has, by the way. After we viewed the inside of the home during the day while the homeowners were at work, the high ceilings, the hardwood floors, the white and aqua blue honeycomb bathroom towel outweighed the all too real work that the home needed, what my realtor called tender love and care. To me and my husband with our 13-month-old daughter, the cottage bungalow was just the right size in the modest, quiet Keewaydin neighborhood, which is walking distance from Lake Nokomis and city biking and walking trails, with a decent school district and park recreation center. And most important, it was affordable on my new teacher's salary. After 15 minutes, my realtor, all smiles, returned to the library with a signed purchase agreement from the homeowners, who had signed the agreement without ever meeting me and my husband. After moving in, I realized two things. One, that my neighbors were the kindest people that anyone would ever have the pleasure of meeting. And two, that my husband and I were the only Black family on our block. What did my realtor know that he did not have the heart to tell me, or that I did not have the heart to see myself? So when I got to you and your wonderful team, and thank you so much, it really was a Jedi Knight moment.
It's the only time anyone's ever called me that.
Well, can you imagine the sense of mapping and thinking about maybe it's a way to help us understand and talk to each other? And, you know, I might get beat up for this. I said it earlier in a training earlier today. You know, I can't live in a place where I assume that every person is malicious. Does that make sense? Which doesn't mean that people don't do bad things. It doesn't mean that people aren't responsible for the trauma and the violence they cause people. But imagine this, if we could just imagine a situation. If I simply just don't want you to live next door to me and I support segregation, do you think I ever imagined the cumulative long-term century impact that it would have on people? If we could get in a spaceship and travel back to the 18th century and we can say, as a result of what you did, this is what happened, I would hope that people would change their actions. And my hope is that they don't understand. And maybe that's the teacher in me, right? So to me, it was exciting, because then not only could I understand, it could be a way to explain it to other people as well.
That's what we're hoping. Do you want to talk about going to vote?
Going to what?
Vote?
Oh, going to vote. Yeah. No, we can talk about it. I'm working on a manuscript now called Witch Wound, and I'm writing about June Jordan. And of course, you know, I'm writing about experiences that I've had. So the election was what, November 4th? It seems like it's in a sci-fi tunnel, like away. And my husband, you know, he did the mail-in ballot, because, you know, we're coming out of COVID. So for so many years we did that. But I'm like, it's the first Black, you know, Asian woman running for president. I wanted my 13 and my 14-year-old to be there, to come with me. And I was, you know, my husband and I, we always, anytime we went to vote, we take our kids with us. But this time it was important. And we're at Keewaydin. So we're all up, and I'm a proud mama, and my kids are like to the point where they're bigger than me. But, you know, I'm like all, you know, chest out. It just is the cutest thing to me. And my 23-year-old, who I describe as a baby in here, she just graduated from college. She's 23 now. So all three of us go to Keewaydin, and my husband is outside in the car. So we walk in, and a woman has on her Lands' End poncho. You'll get it if my second book comes out, because I joke about Lands' End, right? Because when Minnesota, all the women wore Lands' End, and then I had to wear Lands' End, right? Like. But I bought the Lands' End coat, and my arms were too long, right? Like, it just can blend in. So she's there. And so it's like 7:15 in the morning, because my kids love school, and they're like, you know, we got to do this. Don't be late for school. And the woman says, "Are you here to vote?" At 7:15 in the morning. She ought to be glad I'm over 50, right? So my 23-year-old, used to be do they call her a voting judge? Like she volunteered, but in her new job, she can't do that. So she says something to the lady, and I just, keep going. So we're in a line, and it is that moment you like switch, right? And all of us who've experienced that moment of oppression, you go on automatic, right? You don't know. And of course, it's even worse for me because I was totally in my privilege. I didn't think that this could happen to me. And I think I said to her something like, I have lived here for over 20 something years. I just walked away. If I had hair that swing, I could swing. I just have afro. And so we're in line, and she comes up to us with the book, and she asks us again, do you need help? And then I turned around and I said, lady, why aren't you asking the other people in line? And it was just so humiliating in that moment. My 14-year-old, my 13-year-old, and my 23-year-old. And my hands are shaking. And then I say again, I have lived here for over 2 decades. This is my neighborhood. This is my place. Ask the other people. So of course we go in, they have the iPad, we're in there. There's another guy, I see him at National Night Out all the time. We're talking about our kids, right? So it's not everyone. And then we go and vote, and my hands are shaking. I'm trying to get my kids back on track. We're looking at the candidates, we're talking about it. And then we walk out, and I see the woman, and she tries to apologize, and after 50, I'm trying to do new things, like it's not my work to train you. So I just said, there are people who get paid, they can help you with this, get training, do better. Thank you for your work. And because I'm a Catholic in recovery, it's all about the manners. So even when you've been treated like crap, you're still supposed to be nice because you walk away with, right? And then we walk out, and then I look at my 13 and 14-year-old, and we're in the car. My 23-year-old, she comes late because she decides to talk to whoever the person is in charge. And I say to my 13 and my 14-year-old, this is why I need you to get education. The world is not fair. I wish I could make it fair, but maybe the only thing I can give you is this. This is why. And it was just kind of horrible, right? And for that, that happened this month. So, but also there's a moment of empathy where I believe that she believed she was doing the right thing. And it doesn't excuse it, right? And maybe I hope as a writer, that's what I could get underneath. That's what we could talk about, right? And then of course, later that day, the results come. And then I wonder how many people are in that space and they don't understand the reverberations and the damage of the decisions that they make. And I'm still thinking about it, right? Like a dog with a bone, I'm gonna chew on it, hopefully write about it, hopefully make it humorous, but it's also sad because here I am in Minnesota above the Mason-Dixon line and literally was almost disenfranchised of my vote in South Minneapolis. There is no safe space. It doesn't matter how much education me and my husband have, right? The only thing that matters was the color of my skin that day. And not only the color of my skin, but how dare you then walk in with 3 other people who are just as big and if not more powerful than me. And that was just, I'm still processing that. And I wondered in that moment, do you understand this is Kuwaitan? Do you understand that Nokomis was one of the most heavily racialized deed neighborhoods in South Minneapolis? I bet you think you were just doing your job. But no, you were influenced by this legacy that you don't even understand affected. But in that moment, I didn't want to give her that. So yeah, here we are. And of course, I tell my friend, and we're going to write about it, and I'm just going to assume that she had on a Lands End poncho, because I think I have one, that same color.
Love you.
Love you too.
Well, I think that's a good, well, not a good, but an appropriate segue to talk about your relationship with Minnesota. So, in Disparate Impacts, which is one of the essays in this book, you describe how you visited 2 universities where you had been offered full rides. Right? In Alabama, you were shown around by a black female graduate student who you called BFGS. She gave you tours of the university and the town where Confederate flags were prominently displayed. And you described that moment when you saw those flags as a needle scratch. I love that. And those flags are what drove you north to Minnesota. That and Prince was involved.
Yes, always. Roger Nelson.
Yeah. So will you read from that essay?
Yeah.
Can I help you in some way? Or no, you got it?
I'll start in a place. Okay. And for those of you who haven't read the essay, John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer on the suburbs of Chicago, and he dressed like a clown to recruit many of his victims. And I told you, I maybe didn't say, my mom was from Southern Illinois, Missouri Valley, small town. When I mean small, like small. And people down there worked in the coal mines. But right on that Missouri Valley, before you cross into Missouri from Illinois, Chester, Illinois, the state penitentiary is there. And it's where they it's a maximum high security prison, some of the most dangerous criminals in the United States. And when I was driving to Alabama, my grandma was concerned about Ku Klux Klan people. And I'm like, but I'm driving past the penitentiary. And again, humor, right? Inappropriate. I think about, I'll read, but I make the comparison of structural racism, right? And thinking about structures. When John Wayne Gacy was caught, it was because of the odor that was coming from his home. And when they came to his home, they started to open up his walls and dig in the floors, and they found the bodies of his victims. And if we think about death, right? What is murder? What is genocide? And again, I'm not making fun, right? And I'm not saying that anyone has a monopoly on pain and suffering. But oftentimes, structural racism kills people like serial killers. But because the bodies fall differently, we don't see it. And so institutions can kill bodies if you think of how many people are victimized by the institution and they don't get through. And if we had a flow chart and comparing, some institutions would have more bodies than serial killers. So I thought how appropriate it may be to use John Wayne Gacy in my essay. And no disrespect to the victims, may they rest in peace and power. And my heart goes out to the family members, but kind of like we were saying earlier, are there frames? It seems that we can see certain types of death and murder, but not others. During my time attending the university, my black body was meant to be embedded and hidden inside the walls, the crawl spaces, and the concrete of the university's institutional structures. My black female body was not meant to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be heard, or to be discovered anywhere in my creative work or within the program itself. Eventually, through my experiences, I discovered facts that I would only tragically realize later should have been of significance to my research selection process when choosing schools and places to live. In 2014, an online journal article ranked the state of Minnesota as the second worst states for blacks to live in the areas of home ownership, incarceration, education, and unemployment. Alabama didn't even make it into the list's top 10. Unfortunately, these institutional experiences and impersonal policy and procedural points of institutional and structural inequity happen to all graduate students, regardless of their identity positions and intersections within their respective institutions. But these daily microaggressions and microabrasions are disproportionately more damaging to marginalized bodies because of the legacy of our historical and institutional positions. Minnesota is now home to me and my family, and we've had great experiences here for which we fully recognize, are fully grateful, and fully value. There were supportive instructors. I had a great job, knock on wood. I exist and intersect within amazing, diverse, and dynamic communities, and my family and I experience our own intersections of privilege. But there has to be a place to voice the challenging experiences too, in the hopes of learning, creativity, and improving the experiences of others. When I left my apartment that morning before the writing seminar, I was happy. The air was crisp and the sun was bright in a blue sky free of clouds. From what I had assumed that day when I first woke up and looked out my apartment window, the weather would be warm. As a result, I wore a light jacket instead of something heavier. By the time I arrived at school, I was freezing my ass off. And I explained this to the department secretaries and janitors I had befriended, as they were much nicer and more welcoming than my classmates and some instructors. It seems that those of us who don't belong can easily recognize each other. And unlike the other GS, they didn't throw me under the bus. After my freezing cold in what was to be my first Minnesota winter, they all laughed at me and advised me that the coldest days in Minnesota are when the skies are the clearest pretty blue, amazingly sunny, and completely and beautifully free of clouds. They laughed at my ignorance in not preparing myself for the onslaught of the obvious cold weather. There was no bridge for me to cross, no state lines and or multicolored flags to indicate that territories and ideologies had changed. After enough microabrasions, I longed for the Confederate flags of the South, because at least the South had clear lines of demarcation and warning. In Minnesota, there were only smiling faces, open classroom doors, and the stinging, persistent coldness that let me know that I was in a new, different place that wasn't really welcoming, and that this place was resistant to me calling it home. Later that evening, I crossed the Mississippi River on my way back to my apartment, and by the time I got to the building, I had to pee so badly that I had trouble unlocking the door. I made it just in time. As I sat on my toilet stool in absolute safety, I thought of the other BFGS, not the BFGS that I too had become, and I wondered, would she ever had attended a writing program in the North instead of a university in Southern Alabama, if she had the choice? Maybe she knew what I failed to realize during our short time together. There are Confederate flags everywhere, even in places where we can't see them.
So, do you have any questions? We can keep talking, but we're here tonight for all of you.
So I just have a question about your different types of writing. I know in this book it's more essays, there's footnotes, but it's also very lyrical. Then there's academic writing and there's poetry. Can you talk a little bit about what resonates with you most?
That's a good question. Thank you. You know, it's really hard because oftentimes the stuff that I wanted to write about wasn't allowed or it wasn't supported. Like in the essay that I just read from, I joke in a theory class, and, you know, I don't know where it is now, but when I was finishing my PhD, I think the program was like 7 in the nation for theory, so it was really important. So we were reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a great novel, right? I love it. But I wanted to say, oh, Frankenstein is the black person in the text. As it's made total sense to me. It's totally made up, totally constructed. And my professor just went off. Oh, this always had to be about race. And I was like, well, when am I not black? Like, but so those kind of experiences over and over again, I shut down, completely shut down and stopped writing. And I was ABD and I left the country. Like I went to Guadalajara, Mexico and did something completely different. Eventually I would come back and defend my dissertation, but I was like, where's my purse? I'm out. So what happened is that I started having really challenging experiences in teaching writing. And I was teaching at a local community college. And I think at that time, less than 13% of black students were passing the class. So either black students had to be incapable of learning, or there was something wrong with the curriculum. And I was like, no, there's something wrong with the curriculum and pedagogy. So I started writing about that. So I found myself writing about stuff, trying to make sense of it because it was so hard for me. And Sun Young and I are really good friends, and she was putting together this anthology, and she knew the story because we have a tight community here of writers of color. And she was like, you got to write about it. I was like, no. And she was like, well, I'm putting together an anthology. It was like, nobody's going to pay for people of color to write. And of course, you know, she did it. And that's who she is. She's amazing. And we went back and forth. And then finally, when I was sobbing to her, she was like, it's perfect. Great. And then that kind of taught me, oh, maybe I can write essays. So in some ways, I think I cheated. I feel like I'm always writing the poem because to me, everything is a poem. I hear everything as music because standard English is not my first language. The first time I took composition in college, I got an F, like a straight up juicy F for fabulous. So I've always felt like it was me pretending. So, and I'm not saying that every person has that experience, but it was my experience just to shut down. And to me, I couldn't separate them. Like you couldn't, if you want me to talk about Shakespeare, I think that's great, but also to talk about being Black, like you can't separate those things. And that was not supported. So for me, I think when I let go and had a place where I felt safe and where I could write about it, then I felt comfortable. But for me, I think it's all a poem. I think it all goes together. It's like the secular with the non-secular. Like I think to me there are no lines, and for me, I write about things that are important to me, things that I care about, things that I'm obsessed about, and I'm not smart enough to say that I planned it out. I just know that I love reading and writing, and I love teaching. And this is how it came together. But most oftentimes it has been those things that that have hurt me or that I've tried to understand or I've seen hurt other people. Does that make sense? I've been writing a series of poems about people of color who died from COVID. And for me, I just got mad one day because people were talking as if those people didn't die. And so I've just started writing. So, yeah. I don't consider myself an academic, no offense to people who are, but I think I'm just a writer. And my hope is that when it's my time to go, that at least I've left a record or I've done something good or I've left something that my prayer is that has some utility for someone. Since being a backup dancer to Heavy D didn't work. You said it can still happen?
We danced before you all got here, I just want to say.
Can you guys dance again? No, I'm kidding.
That's later.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for sharing all of this, all of your experiences. I read some of your chapters beforehand and could only think of the word generous, like just in your ability to make this legible for people outside of your experience, but also you come back to these institutions, you don't shut the door. And so kind of to the last point that you made, I wonder how you want to see this work change, not just inside of the academy, not just at the institution, but what if little Ty picked up this book and maybe how could that change the mobility that people feel, young people feel inside of this world that, for better or worse, exists?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and thank you for asking. For me, I had a lot of shame around it, so it's hard for me. And actually, I was working on another book. We were working on an anthology with the University of Minnesota Press, and I submitted it, and it was a finalist, but it didn't get the final prize. And the editor knew about it, and he was like, well, I want to see it. I was like, no, you don't want to see that. And then he was like, yes, I want to see it. And then when they said, oh, we want it, I thought, are you for real? So for me, I think I still struggle with shame because I think part of oppression is if you're the oppressed, you're not supposed to talk about what happens to you. Your job is no matter what they throw at you, you're supposed to survive. See, Gladiator? Like you're supposed to make it out. And so if you complain about it, then somehow you failed. Somehow it's not good. So I still battle with the shame, but I'm glad I have it out, that it's done. I think what I would say is that I encourage other people to tell their stories because I'm just one person. And even within my identity as a Black woman, it's not a monolith. It's so different. So my hope is that other people will be inspired, that they will tell their stories, that they won't have shame, that they will understand we are individuals. Yes, we're having a spiritual experience, but we're also having a human experience. And we are affected by institutions, whether we can see them or not. And then my hope is that we can start to create frames to change people's experiences in order to improve people's experiences. That's my hope. And on a more radical sense, because I feel like I'm always on the radical train too, that people won't be able to say that that didn't happen. So when I write about George Floyd, and I go back to Thomas Jefferson, who I adore, and I mean that in a serious sense. And he's very problematic, but very American. people won't be able to say that didn't happen. And can I give you an example, if I can flash through? So we talked about Thomas Jefferson, right? So you know he had a relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings. That's not my words. That's Professor Kathleen Kerrison. And this was in the Washington Post in 2018. And so you can imagine I read that and I was like, what? And that's how and she's a woman. And that's how the article started off. And of course it was about that she disappeared, you know, so it's problematic on so many levels, right? So I can't even imagine if you're passing, like we could historically bore you with. Other than, of course, you know, the young folks worked it out in Teen Vogue, why you can't ever call an enslaved woman a mistress, right? If you can't consent, it's rape, period. End of discussion, right? So I feel like my work, that's what my work is. To get in that space of where you say it's this. No, that's not what it is. This is what it really is. And then let's figure out how to fix it. So that's what I hope, right? Phyllis Wheatley, the original, we have a first edition here, part of the Givens collection. Again, great poet, fantastic bedrock for American literature and African American literature, women's literature, right, intersectional. But I was always interested in the story that they estimate that she was kidnapped and taken at age 5 or 6. And how do they know this? Because she didn't have her teeth. Her teeth were falling out. So what happens when you talk about Phyllis Wheatley, but you don't talk about her not having any teeth? Right, so how do we tell the story? This is Dr. Susan Moore, and I still haven't been able to write about her. May she rest in peace and power. And I'm kind of like a dog. I think I put that in my introduction, like you're circling around. And she is a physician. She died of COVID. She had a systemic illness. She was trying to explain to the doctors, this is what's wrong with me. This is what I need. They said she was cranky. She was disrespectful. And she was released from the hospital, right? And she died. So if you let the dominant story tell, what's the stereotype of a black woman? Loud, cranky, not smart, she doesn't know what's going on. No, she was killed and murdered by structural racism because racial stereotypes of black women in America. So I hope in some ways that my essays tell that story, but I also have to honor that that's not my subject position. I have to look in other ways to do it. And then in that way, as a scholar of literature, but also as writing, yes, it's literature, but for people who are oppressed, the literature becomes what? The historical artifact to bear witness that this thing happened. Think about those babies right now on the border who were snatched away from their parents. Imagine the plays, the poems, the songs, the art, the painting, everything that's gonna come out to say this thing happened to us. No, you can't gloss it over. This is what really happened. So my hope is in my writing, that's what I try to do. And I have to interrogate and start with myself first, not because I'm narcissistic, but you know, I can only start with the subject position that I have, right? And then move from that. And in some ways I think it's healing, right? It's my hope. So that's how I kind of think about it if it answers your question. And I like Kwame Appiah, and he's British and Ghanaian. And he's quite brilliant. And he says, you know, there's this sense that if we're talking about liberalism or equity, if you live in a society where your identity is controlled by a dominant society, you can never have freedom. You can never achieve liberty. You can never be an individual. I'll give you an example. So when Trayvon Martin was walking with the Skittles and the Snapple, to the person who murdered him, he was what? A criminal. Right? And he shot him and he's dead. And of course, then what? A jury affirmed that. Did it matter what he really was? The dominant culture decided that. And as long as the dominant culture was more powerful than his personal individual identity, he could never achieve liberty. So as we look around the room, if we look in our neighborhoods, if we look in our communities, who are other people walking around with that same identity, that it's not who they really are, it's what society says they are, and then they are subject to experiences that are so intimate and personal that it literally affects whether or not they live or die. And that's the space that I hope to write in. And it's interesting because it's nothing new, right? We can go back to Thomas Jefferson and probably before and see it happening, over and over and over again, right? And as we sit here, we had an election, but nobody talks about the bomb threats that were called into predominantly black neighborhoods. Literally Jim Crow, Fannie Lou Hamer right in your face. But yet we sit, you look on mainstream media, there's what? Nothing. So my hope is somehow to write about that. So yeah, I'll write about the essay, going to Kuwait, and my friend with the Lands End, smock. But then hopefully I can then connect it to black people still being disenfranchised in 2024. Just with Lands End coat on instead. Yeah, sorry that was long-winded. Yeah.
I think we are actually out of time.
Okay, good. Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you both so much. Such a wonderful conversation. I could listen to you for a lot longer. So thank you all for attending tonight's event, either in person or online. And I want to thank our guest, Taiyon Coleman, and of course, Kirsten Delegard. At this time, I'm going to ask that you all remain seated while Katie escorts Dr. Coleman to the book signing table in the atrium. Before we move to the atrium for a reception, I'd like to remind you that the university libraries host several events each year under the umbrella Friends Forum, a series for curious minds. These events are made possible by the support of friends and donors like you. The next event is our annual Feast of Words, which this year features Teresa Moses on Tuesday, January 28th, 2025, at the Campus Club in Kaufman Union. Teresa is Associate Professor of Graphic Design and the Director of Design Justice at the University of Minnesota. So at this time, we can move to the atrium for refreshments, conversation, and a book signing. And books are available for purchase.